Okay, Mel Winstead, the Bible professor here. I'm so excited to share with you this several-part series, Lessons from the Land. These are pictures, thoughts, lessons from my recent tour here in 2023 to Israel, the Holy Land. I hope you stick around, learn lots of lessons from the Gospels and from the Old Testament about where things happen right here in the land of Israel as we traveled, hiked to these places and through these places, through the archaeological digs and swimming in the Sea of Galilee and walking around the old city of Jerusalem and floating on the Dead Sea and so many cool things like that, all related to the scripture. And so here we go. First of all, we started off in the Galilee region, right by the Sea of Galilee itself. The Galilee is shaped like the Kinnor, the Hebrew heart, from the Old Testament period. It comes from the Hebrew word Kinneret, so the modern word is Yam Kinneret, the lake of the Galilee. This word Kinneret means to roll or a circle, and really it's referring to the shape. Now, this comes over. I'll give you some thoughts from the Lexham Bible Dictionary and Logos software on the entry Galilee, Sea of. At any rate, this word Kinneret comes over in our English Bibles as Chinnereth or Chinneroth, even in one place. So Numbers 34:11, Joshua 12:3, Joshua 13:27. Luke chapter 5 calls it the Sea of Gennesaret, as does Josephus in his Antiquities. And John calls it the Sea of Tiberias in John 6:1 and John 21:1. Josephus in his Wars also refers to it as the Sea of Tiberias. At one point it was renamed in honor of Tiberius Caesar. Geologically, the Sea of Galilee is located below the headwaters of the Jordan, which flows downhill from the upper Galilee region, empties into the lake, proceeds out the south end here, and finally arrives here at the Dead Sea. Both the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee are located in a geological rift known as the Afro-Arabian or Afro-Syrian Rift Valley. It runs about 1/6 of the Earth's circumference. The land, because of the food grown there and the water source and just its geographical location between ancient military powers, the land sat at a crossroads, really, especially up here in the Galilee region. Lower Galilee comprises the lake itself and the immediate areas surrounding it. It includes Mount Tabor, a volcanic mountain 2,000 feet tall, and the Horns of Hattin. Additionally, two escarpments are visible from anywhere around the lake, the Golan Heights on the eastern shore, and Mount Arbel, about 600 feet tall, on the western shore. The Arbel and the Golan are responsible actually for creating the winds that blow over the lake and produce ferocious storms. The lake itself is located 690 feet below sea level. It's roughly 15 miles long and 6 miles wide. In the Old Testament, this lake is mentioned. A couple of elements from the fishing industry of the Galilee region are mentioned in the Old Testament. The seine net in Habakkuk 1:14, the place of for the spreading of nets, Ezekiel 26, and 47 as well. Mendel Noon in his book, The Sea of Galilee and its Fishermen, and also ancient stone anchors and net sinkers from the Sea of Galilee. This man is a local there on the lake who, over the decades, collected artifacts from the Sea of Galilee. He's researched, studied, and written on the boats, the fishing industry, the types of nets used in the Sea of Galilee. Fishing industry was big over the millennia and still is a big industry there on the lake today. So we go up on the Arbel. So when we go up on the Arbel, again, we're several hundred feet in the air, and you look down. You're able to look down out over. It's quite a panoramic view of the region. Look down over the lake and so forth. And when we go up top, and it's a good bit of walking, as there is most days when you tour the Holy Land. Up on top at the park entrance to go out to the cliff and the precipice of the Arbel there's part of my group, and our tour guide getting us acclimated with a map there, and there's a map behind her on the wall that you see here. On the sides of this rock mountain are lots of caves that the Jews used as fortresses to hold out against the Romans a couple different times during the wars. When you go down below on the bus or from the ground level, the road below, you can look up and see the caves up in here on the sides of this Arbel mountain. Okay. Josephus mentioned this place. He was here, actually. He says this, but when Demetrius was informed of the death of Nicanor and of the destruction of the army that was with him, he sent Bacchides again with an army into Judea, who marched out of Antioch and came into Judea and pitched his camp at Arbela, a city of Galilee, and having besieged and taken those that were in the caves, for many of the people fled into such places, he removed and made all the haste he could to Jerusalem. There it is again from the road below. And once again, a couple of things about this canyon here. The winds blow through here. They come bowling down through here. They roll across. They blow across the Sea of Galilee. The winds hit the Golan Heights on the right, roll back over and meet the oncoming winds, and this creates fierce storms such as you would have in the Gospels, where Jesus. The boat is sinking and Jesus has to calm the storm, and he's walking out on this lake one day, and he's showing, teaching Peter and the others a lesson of faith and whatnot. And so there's a picture of the geological features that show you how the winds are actually created to create the storms out on the lake. Also, through this same canyon, it's called the Valley of the Winds and Doves, that goes up behind here. This is actually an ancient path that goes back even before the days of Jesus. There is a hiking trail. You can actually hike through here nowadays, so that you will actually visit Cana of Galilee, Nazareth, Sepphoris, and on down to Magdala, or the lake, and up and around to Capernaum. So this is the trek. This is the actual path Jesus would have walked on back in the day, and we walked up this path. Only a couple hundred yards. We weren't. It wasn't on our agenda to hike that day, but we did get to check this out for a few moments. Sea of Galilee is very beautiful. This is a picture taken out the back of the hotel on the little patio there, and like the lake is right there. And what I've circled on the screen is the Golan Heights and the sun rising up over the country of Lebanon over there. But that's the Golan Heights over there on the eastern shore. Also in the region, there's this stone. There are these stones around here. Several of these stones set up. Not all of these are ancient. Some have been reestablished or set up by recent pilgrims or whomever. 1 Samuel 4 and 7 calls this a stone of help. The Hebrew is Ebenezer or Ebenezer. Most English speakers would say this was set up after a victory in battle against the Philistines to commemorate God's once again helping the Israelites. So these kinds of stones were set up as memorials to commemorate how God had helped them. The horns of Hattin here are so called because each end of this little mountain range are pointed upward. This area was built up on an ancient volcano. There have been battles here. There have been battles fought here over time. Saladin was here many centuries ago, and so lots of battles, skirmishes fought here in this area. Interestingly here, wheat is grown around this area. A lot of wheat, fish from the lake, and as one of the guys in our tour group, Steve Hasse, had mentioned, he picked up from the tour guide that, just to see how Jesus so strategically chose Capernaum. He strategically chose this area because it was a breadbasket. It fed people. There was the lake for water, for fish. There was the grain grown here. It was a crossroads of culture, right? The Roman garrison at Capernaum, for instance. That there was a Roman tax collector booth there, right? Because Matthew worked for the Roman IRS, so you had that going on. Okay, so this is the Galilee region, a beautiful region, a region that's full of events from both Old Testament and the Gospels. Okay, we're going to talk about Capernaum and Bethsaida now, and the boat ride out on the Galilee, and then go down to Magdala, to the archaeological excavations there and the Jesus boat. Stick around to the end, and I'll just run through a long list of things that happened in the Bible right here in this region that we've toured for these couple of days. We find a huge town that's been excavated, most especially the synagogue, but there are houses and other things there. The synagogue ruins were identified by American archaeologists by the name of Robinson in the mid-1800s. There's an octagonal church there excavated in the early 1900s. Some of the streets and houses in this town date to the 1st century BC. Underneath the Byzantine octagonal church, a large room was found that showed that it was a worship place at the end of the 1st century, and there were scores of graffiti written in Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Syriac, as well as images of crosses and a boat scratched on the plaster walls, say Rousseau and Arrive in Jesus in His World, a book on biblical archaeology. Capernaum is known as Tel Hum. It was located on the Via Maris between Ptolemais and Caesarea Maritima and Damascus. The town of Capernaum is mentioned 16 times in the New Testament. Jesus coming here and having lived here in Nazareth both fulfill Isaiah 9 prophecy. Let's look at that prophecy for just a moment. Isaiah 9 says, "There will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt, but later on he shall make it glorious by way of the sea, on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them." Matthew says quite clearly this was a fulfillment of Jesus being here. One of the several very interesting things about Capernaum is that Jesus made this town his headquarters. Matthew's very clear about this. It came to be called his own city. Yes, he was born and raised as a young fella he was born in Bethlehem, but raised as a young fella in Nazareth, but he relocated to Capernaum at some point. The town, the sign on the right as you go in the gate of the current excavation sites called the Capernaum, the covering of Nahum. You have the consonants there for Kippur, the covering of Nahum. It's come over in English to Capernaum. Most people don't even notice the PH on the sign as you walk in, but anyway, just one of those fun things to observe as you're touring the Holy Land. There's an octagonal church that was found here. Now, first couple times I went to Israel, there was no modern church building built over these ruins, but today you have this huge modern church built over it to protect it, I suppose. Anyway, this octagonal church was excavated in the early 1900s. Some of the streets and houses in the town date to the 1st century BC. There was a worship place underneath. Price and House in the Zondervan Handbook of Biblical Archaeology says, of particular interest is the largest house of the complex, measuring 23 feet by 21 feet since the 4th century. The house has been identified as the house of the Apostle Peter. In AD 385, Atheria wrote, "In Capernaum, out of the house of the first of the apostles, a church was made." In 570 AD, another person wrote, "We came to Capernaum into the house of St. Peter, which is a basilica." According to Price and House, some archaeologists thought it reasonable that the inner room of the St. Peter's house was treated as a venerated hall from the 1st century onward and was associated with the memory of Peter. In other words, it was remembered as the house of the apostle. And Price and House say, quote, "In the successive centuries, the house continued to be venerated, and eventually an octagonal Byzantine basilica was erected over the house centered on the venerated room." Matthew 4:13 says, "Leaving Nazareth, he came and settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. And so Matthew sees Jesus coming to relocate here as a fulfillment of Scripture. One of the primary things you definitely want to see and will see is the synagogue. There's a lot to say about the synagogue, but I will just read you from the Zondervan Handbook. Luke records that, and I'm quoting, Luke records that a certain centurion of Capernaum loved Israel and built a synagogue. One of his servants became sick, and although he calls himself unworthy, he believes Jesus only needs to say the word and his servant will be healed. Jesus praises the man's faith and heals the servant. Perhaps one of the most famous sites outside Jerusalem in Israel is the synagogue at Capernaum. Since its excavation from 1905 to 1921 and again in 1969, it has been the site of the Christian pilgrimage. However, the synagogue that stands partially restored is from the late 2nd or 3rd century. It is constructed of an imported white marble. It's actually basically limestone, I think. However, when Virgilio Corbo dug trenches along the walls, he discovered the foundations of an earlier building from the 1st century. The stones of this construction, like those of the ruins of the Roman houses surrounding the synagogue, were made of the regional black volcanic basalt. Corbo identified these foundations as part of the earlier synagogue, most likely the one Jesus would have known and taught in. The Capernaum synagogue is built in the basilica style, with the central aisle and two side aisles separated by columns. There was a narrow porch in front of the synagogue and courtyard to the east of the main hall that featured a covered portico around the edges. The whole building was oriented north-south so that prayers could be directed toward Jerusalem and was located about 100 yards from the shore. Excavations also revealed that Romans lived alongside the Jews, as Capernaum was a garrison town housing a detachment of Roman soldiers. This fact explains the presence of the centurion in Luke's account. End quote. One thing about the basalt foundation of an earlier synagogue underneath the current white synagogue, Craig Evans, in his book Jesus and His World, the Archaeological Evidence, he says, it is the foundation of the older one underneath is out of square, and far worse, not level. When one faces the side of the synagogue with the front and the entrances to the right, one will notice that the basalt foundation slopes downward from left to right. To compensate for this slope, the builders of the limestone synagogue had to prepare stones in the first tier that increase in depth from left to right, stone by stone. The stonemasons did a remarkable job making the new foundation level. Why did the builders of the limestone synagogue go to this trouble? Why did they not replace the sloping out of square foundation with a proper foundation? The answer is found in the Jewish tradition of building upon a sacred foundation, standing on the shoulders of those who went before us, as we might say. The Apostle Paul alludes to this idea when he speaks of Christ as the foundation on which he and other leaders in the church build, 1 Corinthians 3. One must build on this foundation and take care how one does so. Something similar is said in Ephesians 2. Christ built upon the foundation, the church built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets. Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. This explains why the builders of the limestone synagogue chose to build upon the sloping out of square basalt foundation. It was the foundation of the older synagogue. Although from an engineer's point of view, this foundation was defective and should have been replaced, from a religious point of view, it was sacred and was to be respected. Upon it, the new synagogue would be built. So then you have houses that have been excavated, and the foundations. The houses, Price and House say, the houses were of typical construction for the time, built out of basalt stones with pebble fill and no mortar. And the floors consisted of beaten earth or pebbles. The walls would not have supported heavy roofs, so it is theorized that they would have been constructed of tree branches covered by a mixture of straw and mud. These were the insula, the Roman-style dwellings of lower-class laborers. Artifacts recovered from the houses consisted of lamps, jars, pans, and cooking pots. So in the background, you see the ruins, the remains of the, some of it's just been restored, of the limestone white synagogue, and that's in the background. The foreground, you see the excavations of the houses the people lived in and other buildings, and those are here. Some of the pillars of the synagogue have been restored here. Others have been found, and they're lying out in the side yard there. But you see here clearly the black basalt foundation of the earlier synagogue underneath the current 2nd or 3rd century synagogue. And again, lots of sections of the pillars and the capitals of those are lying out here for you to view. Olive press, wine press, other artifacts were found here. A frieze of a Torah ark, most likely is what this was located here, and you can read up on that. And then you leave on the left of the town is Capernaum, the town of Jesus. We saw the sign on the right coming in. This is the sign on the left coming in. Now we'll go right down the road, right along the shoreline, to the area of Bethsaida, where several of the fishermen lived. Jesus called them to follow him. This is where the area where nets were spread for mending and repairing during the day. It's where the warm springs, Heptapagon, so the current area called Tabgha is a shortened version of this Greek word, the 7 springs. So the fish gather here in the winter months where it's warmer, and the fishermen do well with fishing there and always have. At any rate, this is where the men set out to do their fishing and where they mended their nets. This is the place where Jesus was on the shore at the end of John's Gospel after the resurrection. He tells them to come have breakfast, and he has breakfast prepared for them on the shore. He recommissions the Apostle Peter at this point. So there are churches built right here together on these sites. One of them is the called the Mount of Beatitudes. There's a church built on that site, an octagonal, modern, beautiful church, and built with 8 sides, commemorating the 8 Beatitudes. In Matthew 5, some say this is actually the region where the Sermon on the Mount was preached, and at one point Jesus got into a boat and he preached to the people on the shore. There's a large area here on the shore that sort of goes uphill. It's like a natural amphitheater there on the shore. It would have held thousands of people. Certainly the feeding of the 5,000 happened in this close vicinity. The Sermon on the Mount somewhere around here as well. And so you have the church of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, the primacy of Peter. Mensa Christi, it's called the table of Christ, where Jesus had the meal prepared for the men on that morning after they're fishing all night. This is post-resurrection. And also the Mount of Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. All of that right here together. So let's look at a few of those. Okay, we'll go to the Mount of Beatitudes, this octagonal church I mentioned. Now, there's lengthy research to be read, archaeological and historical research to be read on Bethsaida. There are 2 areas vying for the actual Bethsaida, and great arguments by archaeologists and historians have gone back and forth on either. Almost a consensus back and forth. At any rate, to make a long story short, there is an area up the hill, a mile inland, and the Jordan River has shifted where it's flowed over time. The area sits on a fault. The shoreline could have been up a lot closer to the excavated town, a mile, 1.2 miles inland. Or Bethsaida could have been. Some argue that it is the actual tell, the excavated tell there right on the shore. The one inland has Roman artifacts. We're told by Josephus that one of the Herod the Great's sons renamed the town Julius in honor of Tiberias Caesar's daughter. I think it was actually renamed after his wife. Others say, well, there's other evidences here. A site that's right on the shore called El Araj, Kirbet El Araj. The site up the hill is Et Tel. On the shore is Kirbet El Araj. And Price and House say that Mordecai Aviam of Kinneret College and his team now suggest that El Araj is the most likely candidate for the location of the lost city of Julius, the home of the apostles Peter, Andrew, and Philip. Further seasons of excavation and analysis of finds will confirm or revise this now tentative conclusion. So again, Bethsaida was either right here on the shore or inland about a mile. So again, there are two different excavation points going on, but the traditional sites that you visit, and a lot of sites, be mindful in case you decide to go with the Bible professor next time. Be mindful that a lot of the places you go in Israel, you are walking in a church from whatever, 5th century, 16th century, whatever, okay? You're on a traditional site. But a lot of times at the same place, we can go outside or go down the stairs underneath or somewhere nearby. It will at least be pointed out to you, if not, we'll actually visit there, the actual archaeological excavations where something actually happened. So this octagonal church here at the Mount of Beatitudes, obviously this is a traditional site. This is not a first century building. So somewhere, even in the yard, right down the road a few hundred yards where there's actual excavation going on, was probably the actual Bethsaida. If the shoreline was up, if the shoreline was back a mile, then the other one was the actual Bethsaida. At any rate, you're in the very close vicinity. And another issue is that somewhere along the shoreline here, very close vicinity, Jesus and the apostles fished. Jesus taught. He called his disciples here. He healed people. He cast out demons very close by. The feeding of the 5,000, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes here inside this church, as inside of most of the churches we visit. Very beautiful inside and outside. This is standing up on the porch of the church. This is standing up on the porch of this church looking down at the lake. Inside of another church over here, Mitzvah Christi, when you go to Tabgha, right next door, so to speak, Ein Sheva, okay, the springs of seven, the seven springs, in the Greek is heptapagon, currently called Tabgha, a shortened version of the word. You'll see signs everywhere that show you where you're standing and the history, what happened here, what you're looking at, the archaeology, and so forth. Since we know Jesus fed the 5,000 plus here, Mark 8:5 says he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to his disciples to serve them. And they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish. So this is a picture of a plate I made there in the restaurant of one evening, in the restaurant of the hotel, from the great buffets they have for you twice a day. I broke up a loaf of bread into 7 pieces and some small fish. The small fish in the lake then and now are the sardines, and they actually have sardines on the menu. So I made that just as a object lesson of what we actually find there in the scripture. Hey, you're in the land of the Bible, right? We did eat the food, by the way. Here at Mitzvah Christi, this is where Jesus appeared. He recommissioned Peter. This is at the end of John's Gospel. Olive Press is found here. Lots of other things. There's a statue of Jesus and Peter here. You notice that this church is literally built on a rock. It's built on a site commemorate where, again, the historical tradition has been that Jesus, that this is the site where Jesus had the breakfast for these guys, where he fed the crowds, a place that was a spreading of nets for the fishermen, and that the fishing industry went way back here is a huge tradition. Inside of this church, you can see it literally is built on top of this rock. You see over on the right there with the arrow that the stones are just mortared right onto the actual bedrock of the ground. Outside, you can go out in the lake here if you'd like. Now let's talk about some things about the boat ride and on the boat ride, and things that we learned and were reminded of as we took a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. When we got out on the lake, I've circled here on the screen the fishing villages we had just left like an hour before. I'm pointing those out here in the picture on your screen. And so we go out there, and we envision Jesus calming the sea, calling the disciples over there on the shore. We talk about the different fishing nets, and the boat captain, he gets up there and he gives me a microphone, right? So he calls me up front to sit on this box and hands me a microphone. Well, you give a preacher a microphone, he's already got a Bible in his hand, you know. So I start teaching from the Gospels where some of these events happened on this lake and on the shore. And that was just so amazing and such a blessing to be there on site where Jesus and the apostles actually were physically, literally here. Mendel Noon, again, I mentioned 2 booklets of his. You can see these in other resource works, but they mention the different nets, types of fishing. There were cast nets, trammel nets, veranda nets. Some of them you put the nets down in the water basically like a wall to encircle the fish, and then one of the fishermen would jump in there, help work the net around, and hence you have the story of in John 21 as Jesus is on the shore, and these men have fished all night, and he tells them to cast the net on the other side of the boat. So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. John 21 verse 7. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. And then another lesson I gave out there, and this is so cool. This is Mark chapter 1, verse 16. As he was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were also in the boat mending the nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and went away to follow him. They went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered in the synagogue and began to teach. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And then he heals a demoniac right off the bat there. But in verse 16, some of these fishermen were casting a net. Okay, they were actively at work trying to catch bait fish or food fish. They were at work, okay? And one preacher, pastor friend of mine, Frank Hamrick, he's explained or sort of given an application here that some Christians today, they're active in ministry. They're active in serving the Lord in whatever capacity. But then he went on a little further, and some of them were having to mend their nets from working so hard all night. Maybe they got hung up. The nets were torn. Maybe they got hung up with the fish tore them, or hung up in rocks or logs underneath, whatever. They had to take time to mend their nets. And again, the application here for people would be today is perhaps some of us need a break from serving and ministry, and we need to take time to mend our nets, right? We need to mend ourselves, right? So there's nothing wrong with taking a break or a vacation or whatever, and then you get back out there casting your net, so to speak, serving the Lord in whatever it is He's called you to do, and do it well, right? And so some lessons we talked about, there's where Christ is, there's life, there's power, there's fruit in the life. There's more than one way to catch fish, both literally for them, metaphorically for us, because he told the guys they were going to be fishers of men. There's more than one way to reach out with the gospel and to share the gospel, and there's this notion of casting and mending. Okay, now we'll visit the ruins of Magdala and then go right down the street to see the Jesus boat. Then, at the end, I'll run through some of the multiple things you learn as you're in this region for a couple of days. Let's go to Magdala. A lot going on with Magdala. It was just excavated in 2009, 2010. So I've actually been to Magdala before when this was just really the yard of the kibbutz there, or the area, and it's just recently been excavated. Price and House do mention, like Mark 8:10, immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. And Matthew 15:39, and sending away the crowds, Jesus got into the boat and came to the region of Magadan. Manuscripts of Matthew 15:39 read Magdala or Magdalon, and a couple read Magadan. And this latter reading, Magadan, is adopted by the NIV and other newer translations. The Aramaic name Magdala Nunaya, Magdala of the fishes, or the tower of the Migdal is tower in Hebrew. The tower of the fish salters. Josephus called it the Greek name Tyrike. And that's another lesson really you need to learn from the land, is that a lot of names you hear today of towns or cities or areas, regions or neighborhoods, might not be the same name that it was in the 5th century. It might not be the same as it was in the 1st century or in the 10th century BC, okay? So you know how language works. A Hebrew name might have been called only by a Greek name later on, and that sort of thing. A lot of that goes on. You've got to do some studying to figure out why those names have changed and to see how it might very well be the same place. So here Tyrike would be Magdala, where most think Mary Magdalene was from. This site is located I'm reading from Price and House, located less than 3 miles from Tiberias and at the junction to the ancient route from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee at the former Palestinian village Al-Magdal, and has been identified with New Testament Magdala. Again, the tower of the fish salters. The name is found in the Nazareth inscription at Capernaum and is mentioned by Josephus, as I said. Magdala in the New Testament era is known from archaeological excavations done in the 70s by Virgilio Corbo. It was laid out in the typical Roman design with a main Cardo Maximus and intersecting side streets. Along the main street, Corbo discovered a synagogue in the typical basilica style, the only 1st century synagogue that has been discovered in Israel, with the central nave divided by 2 rows of columns and a perpendicular aisle across the back. Late Hellenistic and early Herodian pottery found within the building confirmed the date of construction to sometime within those periods. The city was a center of fishing on the Sea of Galilee, as evidenced by the 1st century fishing boat, known as the Ancient Boat, and displayed at the kibbutz Nafgenesar, being about a mile north of here. Excavations began. Galilean excavations began in June, July 2010. They've uncovered a number of Second Temple period structures at the site, including, I'm still reading from Price and House, including a room with various tanks for holding different types of fish that you see here. A site where fishing boats were tied to harbor streets, and a synagogue that you see here. Of special interest was the discovery of the synagogue with an ornately carved stone Torah stand or podium at its center. The relief on the structure contains detailed images of the objects related to the priestly service in the Second Temple, including a pair of 2-handled jugs, an oil lamp, a golden altar of incense, and a menorah, its earliest known depiction. Also depicted atop the relief is a large 6-petal rosette that was a common design in Jewish funerary art during the Second Temple period, similar to a find at Gamla on a lintel stone flanked by 2 palm trees. These images were most likely made by an eyewitness to these vessels within the temple in Jerusalem. They end with these comments. The importance of the Magdala synagogue and the Magdala stone is that together they add new support for understanding the synagogue as a sacred space even while the temple remains standing. Scholarly consensus has long held that synagogues were only places for assembly and study of the Torah and other sacred books, but not sacred spaces in their own right. The archaeological excavations at Magdala, in addition to confirming the New Testament site, are challenging this consensus, end quote. So here are the ruins of the synagogue at Magdala. Magdala is also really cool there because over behind here, they built the church. The Duken Altum is actually a church built in honor of the women mentioned in the Gospels. So there's a pillar inside the rotunda, Mary Magdalene, with Mary Magdalene's name on it. There's a statue of Mary Magdalene and Jesus outside. Inside this church, there's a replica of a first century boat there inside the chapel. And you can sing inside this rotunda, and it has great acoustics, as many of the churches in the land do. So if you have people in your tour group who can sing and just lead in a worship song there, it's always a special time, and we had that here as well. Over to the side was another chapel, and I was able to share here. The painting on the wall behind me is a painting by someone of the woman touching the hem of Jesus' garment. And so I also shared in here about Mary Magdalene and how the sculptor Donatello sculpted this, the old hag, it's called, Mary Magdalene, and just showing her posture and how that she looks very haggardly, right? She had a rough life, and tormented by the demons in her life, but her posture is really cool. Her posture is that of prayer. She knows where her help came from, and she was devoted to Jesus Christ after she came to faith in Him for the rest of her life. In fact, because of her devotion, Mary was granted the huge blessing of being the first one to the tomb on the Sunday morning to see the empty tomb and the resurrected Christ. Okay, then right down the road is the kibbutz and the new museum that houses the Jesus boat. This is a preserved first century fishing boat. This boat was featured in Biblical Archaeology Review magazine. The hull was found in the mud when the lake was at a very low level. The IEA, the Israeli Antiquities Authority, was called in. They excavated the boat, encased it in some preservative material, and floated it to its current location. Everything about it dates to the 1st century BC and into the 1st century AD. It was the kind of boat Jesus and the disciples would have fished in. That's the upshot of it, really. It's called the Jesus boat. No one is saying that Jesus actually fished in it, okay? No one's saying that. All they're saying is this is the style of boat, and it dates to the 1st century, for sure, or even to the decades before the time of Christ. Price and House have this to say: until recently, the only evidence available of the construction of 1st century fishing boats used on Sea of Galilee were crude drawings and 1st century excavations in the Mediterranean. However, in 1986, a severe drought lowered the water level several meters below normal. Two brothers, mentions their names, were searching the northwest shoreline for exposed artifacts and discovered the outlines of ancient fishing boats buried in the mud flats. The boats were excavated. Although popularly called the Jesus boat, there's no evidence they say Jesus used or had any connection to it. However, it may well have been used at the time of Jesus, as radiocarbon dating has given a date circa 40 BC. The wood used for the boat was not original to it. Rather, it was recycled from other construction and consists of 11 different varieties of trees. At first, this was a surprise to scholars who studied the boat, but it has been theorized that numerous repairs have been made to it throughout its life. The boat is approximately 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, and built in the typical mortise and tenon construction of the time period. It is thought that the boat could have accommodated a crew of 15. This analysis compared to ancient descriptions of crews and accounts of naval activities conclude that this is the type of boat the disciples of Jesus would have used to transport him from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other, as the gospel narratives detail. End quote. And this boat was featured in Biblical Archaeology Review that you see here. And so that's a unique find for us as well. One of the other really neat things we did was baptism. A lot of people go to Israel and they want to be baptized in the Jordan River. It happened that time we were there this summer, back in June, that the tour guide said, well, the Jordan River's really down low. It was really busy. It was really muddy. Why don't you just baptize in the Sea of Galilee this afternoon? Because the Sea of Galilee water is Jordan River water anyway. The Jordan River is what fills the lake and then empties out the south end. So we did just that. Baptized 9 people out back of the hotel one afternoon, and found out later one lady who was a believer had never been immersed, water baptized. So I was blessed to be able to do that for her, and we had great fellowship witnessing that out there one afternoon as well. And later on, it was really cool, but later on when we were down at En-Gedi in the desert near Qumran, near the Dead Sea, one of my students took a picture and it says, Mel the Baptist came baptizing in the wilderness. I thought that was pretty funny. All right, let me run through some things. Some of it will be rerun, some highlights, and some review and some additional passages of scripture and events that happened here in and around, or on and around the lake. The Gospels refer to the Sea of Galilee 43 times. Sometimes it's called a lake, sometimes translated a sea. On the banks of the Galilee at Cursey, Jesus exorcised demons and sent them into a herd of swine. On the north shore, we mentioned Capernaum, Bethsaida, but also north of there is Chorazin. Jesus cursed these 3 towns, and as you see today, all 3 of them are just piles of rubble. Jesus cursed these 3 towns, doomed them because of their unbelief of all the miracles he had done and what he had done for them, and they still refused him by and large, rejected him. The disciples whom Jesus called into service, some of them made their living here, whether it be the tax collector Matthew or 4 or 5 of the fishermen from the region. Jesus preached from a boat on the Sea of Galilee, Matthew 13. He taught by the shore, Mark 4. He calmed the sea, Mark 4:35. He recrossed the Galilee to Capernaum, Mark 5:21. He walked on the lake, Mark 6:45 and following. He cast out the demons, as we said, Mark 5. Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, Mark 5:21. He fed 5,000, John 6. The miraculous catch of fish, recommissioning of Peter at Mensa Christi, John 21. The healing of a demoniac, Mark 1:21. The healing of Peter's mother-in-law, Matthew 8:14. The healing of a paralytic, Matthew 9. The healing of the centurion's servant, Matthew 8:5. Matthew 8:24 records Jesus' calming a severe storm that had risen on the sea. Chorazin is mentioned. It's part of a triad of cities that Jesus ministered in and finally condemned. Matthew, the tax collector, was stationed in Capernaum. The bleeding woman, Mark 5:21. The man with the paralyzed hand, Mark 3. Jesus having the guys to be sure they paid the temple tax, Matthew 17:24. The call of the disciples, Matthew 4:18, Mark 1:16, Luke 5:10. Christ prayed in the fields nearby, Mark 1:35. Christ's teaching on humility, forgiveness, and offenses. Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 18. The coin taken from the mouth of the fish, Matthew 17:24. And many more things happened and were taught by Jesus, performed by Jesus, other events here from the Gospels and also in the Old Testament. Here on and around the lake of the Sea of Galilee. So this has been a great blessing. Check back for the next episode is going to cover our trip to Mount Carmel, Caesarea, Nazareth, Tel Megiddo. 4 important areas there, both for Old and New Testament. The life of the Apostle Paul, also Herod the Great, all of that will be brought in at Caesarea. Hope you'll check out the next episode on that. If you want to join me, God willing, I intend to take another tour in 2025. So just check on the community tab, my information, email me if you'd like to contact me about that. I hope this has been a blessing. Check out the next episode as we go out to the Mediterranean to Caesarea. Be blessed. I'm the Bible professor.